Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. I'm your host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Dr. Carl Drexler. Carl, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I work for the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. I'm one of the research station archaeologists. There's 10 of us scattered around the state. I run the regional station in the southwest corner of the state. I got a research station on the campus of Southern Arkansas University, home of the Mule Riders, and I I teach here at SAU a little bit. I also do a lot of original research and public outreach across 11 counties out of Southwest Arkansas. And my research territory borders into Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. So I get to work with colleagues in those states a fair amount as well on literally everything from, you know, Paleo-Indian sites in northern Louisiana to uh, uh, locating the remains of a deceased circus elephant from the 1980s once. It's a very interesting job at times.
Yeah,
Um,
archaeology is never boring.
it's never boring. You're never entirely sure what's going to walk through the door, or what's going to show up in your inbox on any day. Which is really it's very true with doing battlefield and conflict stuff. I get emails from colleagues a lot about, hey, I found a thing. Is this, what is this? Is this something that could, explode? And a couple times a year, I have to, sort of advise people about, well, that's, yeah, you probably shouldn't have that on display. You should call the bomb squad. Or no, I think that's, that's a shot put or a gate weight, or, there's a host of things that kind of look like cannonballs that actually aren't. So try to help people out by explaining what they're looking at the best I can.
So, that brings us to what we're talking about today, and that's battlefield archaeology. That's an ongoing interest for people, especially in the field of archaeology, is battlefields always warrant, a second look at it, a third look at it, and it changes with every look you take at it. Am I wrong in saying?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it they change. They're really hard to investigate. And we went for years thinking that it was basically, a battlefield was simply too expansive and too ephemeral to really characterize, because we're used to working in big open excavation blocks, and you just simply can't do that across the size of a battlefield. But then in the 1980s, there was a fire out at a Little Bighorn battlefield, and a couple of Park Service archaeologists and also from the University of South Dakota went out there and figured out, through systematic metal detection and the use of surveying equipment to individually piece plot artifacts. They sort of developed a methodology that we still use today with modifications. We've made some refinements over the years, but it was a Little Bighorn work in the 80s really sort of set the template.
Yeah, and Little Bighorn is something that everyone uses as an example for battlefield archaeology because it changed so much of our perception of what we thought Little Bighorn was. Like everyone thought that it was an organized thing, but it was chaos in every direction because you find artifact scatters everywhere in every direction.
Yeah, and we're able to say that because Richard Fox and Doug Scott, the people who were really heavily leading the work at Little Bighorn, when they piece plotted all the bullets and all the cartridge casings that they're finding, and then they subsequently did a lot of the bullet and tool mark uh, um, analyses on, to where you could actually sort of see see things move across the battlefield, and see that basically you're watching the people move. You're reconstructing an event that from for Custer's contingent, of course no one survived to leave a story. There are some Native American accounts of the battle, just the way that they're structured and the way that they sort of record the event. they're very different from the sort of military after action reports that a lot of people are more familiar with looking at. And so you can sort of use a lot of those sources together to reconstruct the event. And yeah, it was, it started off with some level of control, but you can actually see that organization really fall apart as the battle progresses. And it's really interesting. You can see that. And, to the point where, I think there's some evidence for certain weapons being in military hands at the start of the battle and then being used by Native Americans towards the end. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that came out of that work because they figured out the methodology.
So when you're reconstructing a battlefield site, you're not just reconstructing how the battle progressed, you're also reconstructing how the people went through it also.
Yeah, yeah, and that's that the main book that came out of Little Bighorn stuff talked about the difference between what they call gross and dynamic patterning. And so the gross patterning is you're basically looking at all the distribution of artifacts across the entire battlefield and sort of where are the hotspots, where you have the most things deposited, where can you put people back on the landscape. And then the dynamic patterning is looking at that gross pattern in greater detail and saying, okay, well, can you see units and sometimes even individuals moving from one spot to the next, sort of reconstruct the flow of the battle, across. It's really an incredibly short time frame compared to what we do in other areas of archaeology. A lot of sites, you're looking at them, they're years, if not generations of occupation. A battlefield can be a few hours. And so trying to, tease all the distribution apart and parts that you're going to find is really kind of a difficult thing. But it's one of the kind of cool things to be able to do within the discipline.
Yeah, and that's something that stands out to me as battlefield sites go, especially, if you go visit one here in the Southeast, somewhere like Shiloh or somewhere like that. It's a massive site, but you also have to keep in mind that hundreds of thousands of people visit it every year, and that changes the way the site is just by people walking through it.
Yep. And also just looking at the way people have preserved individual battle sites over, through the years. I mean, when parks are set up, a lot of times they're set up before you have, archaeologically based understandings of where the actual footprint is. So there are parts that are in, say, a park boundary versus not. You have to look at, the history of park policy in terms of permitting, relic hunting on the ground. So, and also, in a lot of cases, before the park was founded, you'd have people go out, particularly with the early metal detector technology that came around, sort of publicly available after World War II. A lot of battlefields got real heavily metal detected before they got, protected. So, you have to. There are a lot of things that you have to consider about what you might not find, in addition to sort of figuring out what you did find when you're working on one of these.
Yeah, so that I guess that happens a lot, like on those cases that you were talking about when somebody brings in something and they say, "Oh, I found this," and you have to,
Yeah.
seriously question whether they found it ethically or not.
Yeah, and sometimes it's simply ignorance of the law. I mean, we have here in Arkansas, we have a lot of folks who would look at, say, like state forest land, and I don't think it occurs to them that that's not something that you can go out and metal detect. But some of our battlefields have big footprints on into state land that's just state forest, it's not state park. And so they'll come and talk very freely about, oh yeah, we're out walking around on this particular state forest and found this, that, and the other thing. It's like, well, maybe don't do that in future because that's not legal. But by the time that's coming through my door, it's already out of the ground. And so they're that we've already lost a lot of the information because almost none of the stuff that collectors bring to me ever, this they never GPS locations or make a good map of it. It's really focused on the item, not the context.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, something that really impacts battlefield archaeology is the context of it as well as the artifact itself. You know, if something gets trampled on a battlefield site or it gets kicked like just across the field or something, it changes the way we look at that object.
It does. There have been some studies that suggest that even with plowing and foot traffic, that there's maybe less disturbance than uh, some might expect. But still, it's the relic hunting is a really, it's a difficult thing uh, to negotiate within battlefield archaeology, because on the one hand, obviously, when people are going out and uh, collecting things, and particularly if they don't record context, we lose a lot of information. We lose our ability to do things like reconstruct Little Bighorn to the extent that was done back in the 1980s. But at the same time, when we go out and work on a lot of battlefield projects, we have volunteers that their hobby is metal detecting, and their ability to find things comes in significant part from their experience. And so, if you hand a metal detector to someone who's never used one before, they'll find some stuff. Your experienced metal detectors will probably find more. And that's when we work on a battlefield project here, a lot of our volunteers are people who, go out and collect on their own. If they work on one of my projects, we work very much to, an archaeological standard on that. And I try to impress upon them, the necessity of doing things in a certain way when they're out here. But also, it's here in Arkansas, it's their legal right to go out on private land, and as long as they have landowner permission to make those collections, so can't stand in the way of that. But do try to educate and encourage as much as possible.
Yeah, that's, I feel like that's an ethical obligation for us as archaeologists is we want them to appreciate the object itself, but also the context and the ethical ramifications of, collecting that object as well.
Yeah, well, and also, I mean, with any artifact, you would encourage that. I think also with battlefields, there's such a public interest in militaria that people a lot of times get so focused on the object that they become less focused on the people who put them there. So like we've been working on a project before where it was a Civil War battlefield in eastern Arkansas, and it found a U.S. Army belt plate that had been struck by a bullet, and people got really excited about finding it's kind of rare to find belt plates, but particularly one that had been struck. That's a real rarity, and people got very focused on oh, this is cool, we found this thing. It's like, well, yeah, that belt buckle was sitting in front of someone's stomach when it was hit, so that you're finding basically a testimonial of the the agony that guy, if he survived, which he probably didn't. There's a lot of sort of moments of pain, not just for the man himself, but for his the other guys in his unit and his loved ones back home, that are basically referenced by finding a lot of these things. And there have been TV shows, and I think there are YouTube shows that focus on like going around Eastern Europe and digging up war graves from World War II, because they're they're either Soviet soldiers who a lot of them wore their medals in the battle, so they find them in the graves, or people are very weirdly excited about World War II German stuff, and so if they find that, then this they get a really sort of unsettling level of excited about having Nazi insignia. but they're literally disturbing people's burials to get that, and you just it's very easy to see that that a lot of the folks who dig this up just don't see the people attached to it, and it's weird. It's a weird aspect of working in this area.
Well, that's I want to say that's an issue everywhere, especially here in the southeast, is people don't think about that when you're like looking at, where a person was buried or is buried, that they used to be a person. Like they don't see the person they used to be, they
Mhm.
see it as it is now.
Right. Yeah. No, that is true. Um, you know, and we have laws in place, to not do that here. But Eastern Europe, apparently that's not a thing that they have to worry about. And it's just I think from the American sensibility about how we do archaeology, you see that you don't see that within the discipline as much, but that sort of culture shift I think we have in archaeology doesn't translate outside of the discipline as well as I think a lot of us would like.
Yeah, and that's something that I think people are starting to take notice of, that we don't respect things as well as we should or could from a legal aspect. And that's why, things like NAGPRA and other legislation change on a fairly regular basis now, just to incorporate that new mentality that people are picking up as we go.
Yeah, well, I think this we've had this professional discussion about the SEAC image policy, where the journal will no longer publish photographs of burial items. It's clearly something written with attention to Native Americans, which is fine, it's great. The way the policy is written, though, it also would stop depictions of, say, U.S. military service members having the stuff that from their burials being published in the same way. And I think that's a good step. And I think this is in Arkansas, after NAGPRA was passed, they passed a state law that basically said, okay, well, don't disturb anyone's unmarked burial. And so I think there's a profit that came to everyone because of the passage of this federal law that was really focused on Native Americans. But I think this is another benefit where our professional adaptations towards Native American interests is benefiting groups well beyond the original intended scope.
Yeah, and that's something that I think people, again, are taking a second look at, is what our professional obligations as well as our adaptations to those obligations are. Like, we change the way we look at things as we go.
Mm-hmm.
So what does battlefield archaeology look like in terms of Arkansas or your region of Arkansas? Because I know it's probably different everywhere in Arkansas.
Yeah, well, we are a regionalized program, but also we each have our specialties, so we can sort of go outside of our region to work on other things that sort of tie into that. So you interviewed Dr. Page at our Plum Bayou Mound Station a little while ago. She and the other folks who worked in that research station do work at sites outside of Plum Bayou that help sort of explain that, so we can take our expertise more widely. For me, I've got a couple battlefields that are in my research station. They're mostly from an event called the Camden Expedition of 1864, which is a small sortie by the U.S. 7th Corps out of Little Rock in the fall of that year, or spring of that year, rather. Also done a lot of work at Pea Ridge battlefield up in northwest Arkansas, and that's arguably one of the most heavily researched from an archaeological standpoint battlefields in all of North America. And we've done massive metal detector sweeps across most of those battlefields over the past 20 plus years. It started with the National Park Service and the Midwest Archaeological Center under Doug Scott, and we've been doing more since. We also have been trying to isolate a very small engagement in eastern Arkansas. It's called the Action at Wallace's Ferry, which is remarkable in that it was one of the only engagements of the Civil War where the U.S. force was entirely African American. We've also got I've got done some work on the trench system that surrounded Little Rock during the war. Some parts of that, have had excavation. A lot of it's, sort of cartographic analysis. We've done some work on the military prison that was now where the Arkansas State House stands. It's Arkansas's first real penitentiary. And so we've got, Arkansas is really interesting because you've got, sort of big pitch battles like Pea Ridge. But then you've also got a lot of small skirmish engagements where tracking them is difficult, not only because they're small, but also they aren't as well remembered as the bigger events are. So there's a lot of work with the official records and contemporary maps that go into the preparation to even go out in the field. And we also have so two of the battlefields I've got sort of long-term research interests on are the Battle of Poison Spring, which is one of the Camden Expedition ones, and the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, which, if you've seen the movie Lincoln, it opens with the real rainy battle scene that's Jenkins Ferry depicted there. And those are interesting projects in that Poison Spring is one of the most notorious racial atrocities of the war, behind like Fort Pillow, Tennessee. And then Jenkins Ferry actually had a retributive act against wounded Confederates perpetrated by members of the U.S. Army. And so, it's doing the battlefield archaeology and just sort of recovering the bullets is one thing, but then also addressing the historical context around them is also quite challenging at times. And with Poison Springs, it takes a long time to sort of lay the groundwork for doing that in a way that is sensitive to its history and the ongoing effect that it has on descendant communities, both here in Arkansas and more widely as well.
Yeah, I was just as you said that, I was just thinking about, this is the kind of, especially like when you talk about battlefields, is you change the narrative, and it's not always going to be something that people want to hear. Like
Right.
it's we use the word re-traumatizing when we talk about traumatic historic events, not re-inflicting the incident on the people, but at the same time, we don't want to hide the real history from them either.
Right. Well, and with be terribly unsurprising to everyone, but the Civil War is still a very hot button issue here in the South. And when you talk to any historically oriented group about the subject, a lot of people in the room are very emotionally invested in the conflict on one side or the other. A lot of that has to do with both family ties to the past, but also, almost everyone in those rooms will, when they talk about the importance of understanding the Civil War and what their people were doing to it, what they're really trying to communicate is they want to be seen as important and worthy of study as well. And it's not so much about the position of history as about their position in the modern context. And so having doing work that basically challenges the received notion on it, I think in a certain way undercuts a lot of people's understandings of how they fit into the world. And so trying to navigate those dilemmas can be tricky at times. And I've given dozens, if not over 100 talks on various battlefield projects here in Arkansas and farther. And almost all the ones here, I get to the end of it and I get three questions. Where am I from? Where do I go to church? and what were my people doing during the war. And this is how they sort of place you as and your knowledge, and whether they have to listen to you or not. And uh I grew up, my dad worked in the oil industry, so we moved around a bunch, but I can claim Houston as the place that I most remember. It was raised Quaker, so they don't really know what to do with that. But when I tell them that all my ancestors fought for the North, then that you can sort of see on their face a change in the way that they look at what I told them, because they're all of a sudden become very sure that I'm out here to also be an agent to undermine their connection in the past, which is not the aim at all. But
it does happen. I mean, like you said, the Civil War is still a very hot button and sensitive topic for everyone,
mm,
especially here in the Southeast, because everyone, whether they know it or not, was probably connected to the conflict in one way or another.
right. Well, and you know, obviously, I know Arkansas, the best, and we and a lot of this probably has to do with the creation of the lost cause mythology after the war. But there's a lot of people now are very much of the opinion that a lot of white Southerners now, I should say, that the South remained unified and was just simply overcome. Well, if you look at the history and some of the archaeology we've done around here, they're the folks in Confederate Arkansas really sort of split in two and started fighting each other. I mean, you've got the Declaration of Martial Law in early 1864. You've got it literally wrote a chapter in an edited volume on irregular warfare about how basically you could take all the lessons for counterinsurgency that you see in the modern field manuals and apply that to what was being done to control the white populace here towards the end of the war. And there's a degree of division and what people call disloyalty to the Confederacy that's running rife through the area. No one wants to, no one now really wants to acknowledge that. They want to have this idea that that people remained unified and determined in their resolve to resist the United States, but it's not really what happened. And it's hard to ignore that when you look what the dirt tells you, but it's not always stories that people want to hear.
Yeah, and that's the challenge of, again, archaeology, especially when we do it in a public setting, is yeah, we're probably going to upset some people when we tell them that what we found is against the narrative that they've been taught for so many years and decades, but at the same time, it's the truth.
Well, it's the truth, and I think also you have to, in many ways, let the people in the past be human. And if you look at how, from an anthropological standpoint, how people respond to conflict situations, the stuff we see happen here is exactly what happens everywhere. People are trying to survive and they're trying to keep their family safe. And what that means, what they have to do to make that happen, can be much more context specific. But to hold up some model where people have to be white knuckling onto a certain ideology above all else, it doesn't, that's not how people operate. And allowing for people to have made their decisions, and we can track that archaeologically and historically, but I think it's dehumanizing to force some certain notions on the past and the way that people responded, particularly during the Civil War. And it's not fair to the people on either side who endured it.
Yeah. So, for people who wanted to learn more about battlefield archaeology or archaeology in Arkansas, what would you recommend for them?
Well, for battlefield archaeology in general, there's, I mean, the touchstone is the 1989 archaeological perspectives on the Little Bighorn. It's a classic. It's Doug Scott et al. On that. There have been several edited volumes and books on battlefield topics that have come out since. You can get on YouTube and find a fair number of documentaries, both on the Little Bighorn stuff and stuff that's been done more recently. The National Park Service actually has some of the reports on the archaeological work on battlefields like Pea Ridge and Wilson's Creek, Missouri, are available free to download. For Arkansas, well, there is a lovely edited volume on historical archaeology in Arkansas, edited by me. That's a good starting point. You can also look at the work of Skip Stewart Abernathy, who's done a lot of publication in that area. And also, the Arkansas Archaeological Survey and the Arkansas Archaeological Society have some websites up dealing with, we've done some recent research at Pea Ridge and just historical, several other historical projects. So you can also follow my research station on Facebook. We've got a lot of projects going on, including some battlefield work as well. And one of the things I've been planning on doing over the last couple of years was take some of the presentations that I was giving to local historical societies about projects and recording them for YouTube. So those should be coming out in the not too distant future.
Well, Carl, thank you so much for joining me here today. I've really enjoyed having you on the show.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for reaching out about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to do it for us today here, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in.